President of Ireland, Dr. Michael D. Higgins, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Tránóna, Mahdív, Fáilte Mór, Monchen, Roív, Galer. Good evening and a very warm Manchester welcome to you all. My name is Patrick Hackett and I am the Registrar, Secretary and Chief Operating Officer here at the University of Manchester. And on behalf of the University, I am delighted to welcome not only all of you joining us in person this evening, but also those joining online for the start of this exciting new series. It's a very special event, the inaugural lecture in the John Kennedy Lecture Series, which for the next 5 years will run within our School of Arts, Languages and Culture to promote topics related to the island of Ireland. And this evening's event is special not only in its own right, but also because it happily coincides with the university's bicentenary. 2024 is a year to celebrate 200 years of learning, innovation and research. 200 years of incredible people and community, and 200 years of global influence. And we have enjoyed and will continue to enjoy rich and productive partnerships with Ireland, and especially in publishing. Carcanet, based in our city and one of the main publishers of Irish poetry in English, is a strategic cultural partner to the university. And our own Manchester University Press has a world-leading list on Irish politics and history, which includes the Irish Society series and books on the Belfast punk scene, the characteristics of Irish political diplomacy, gender and inequality, and much else. But back to tonight, and it is an enormous honour that the inaugural lecture is being delivered here by the President of Ireland. Before introducing President Higgins, let me pay tribute to another exceptional and inspirational Irishman, John Kennedy. John has founded and made possible this lecture series through his generous support. And we are delighted that he, his partner Susan, his son Simon, daughter Nuala, and grandson Jack are here tonight as honoured guests. He made Manchester his home 67 years ago, and 4 years into his residency here, established in John Kennedy Civil Engineering, what would become one of the UK's most successful construction and engineering companies. He passionately believes that success entails putting something back, and over the years has given generously of his time, energy, and support to causes closest to his heart. We feel extremely proud to be associated with him and privileged to be hosting this initiative that gets underway tonight. So please accept our sincere thanks, John. So now, I have the honour of introducing the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, or, to be strictly correct from a university perspective, President of Ireland, Dr. Michael D. Higgins, following our conferment upon him yesterday of the degree of Doctor of Letters honoris causa. In welcoming him, we are also delighted to have here with us his wife, Mrs. Sabina Higgins, and to be joined by the Ambassador to Ireland to Great Britain, His Excellency Mr. Martin Fraser, and by Ireland's Consul General in Manchester, Ms. Sarah Mangan. And if I might, I'd like to pay tribute to Sarah and her team for the incredible success that she's already achieved in a very short period of time in establishing the Consul here in Manchester. Thank you, Sarah. Now, given his prominence in public life, President Higgins is, in one sense, one of those people of whom it is actually true to say he needs no introduction. But applying that expression here tonight would do scant justice to his life and career achievements. Those among you who attended our honorary degree ceremony last night will have heard in the citation from my colleague, Professor John McAuliffe, about some of the President's many accomplishments in more detail. But let me touch briefly upon them here. He is, as most, if not all of you will know, the 9th President of Ireland, having been directly elected by the people of Ireland in 2011, and then again 6 years ago to his second term of office. During his first term, in fact, exactly a decade ago this month, the President was welcomed by Queen Elizabeth II on a state visit to the United Kingdom, the first by an Irish head of state. He also previously served at almost every level of public life in his country. Driven by a desire to work more directly for equality and justice, he has been a councillor, a mayor, served as a senator in the Shannon for 9 years, and as a TD for 25 in Dáil Éireann. Before becoming president, he was Ireland's first Minister for Arts, Culture and the Gaeltacht. But in addition to being a statesman, he is a published poet and writer, as well as an academic who undertook postgraduate research here at the University of Manchester and lectured in political science and sociology, both at the National University of Ireland in Galway and in the United States. His thought leadership has continued in his current role, where he initiated a presidency of ideas following his inauguration. In that vein, the President hosted a series of seminars as part of Ireland's Decade of Centenaries entitled Macneve 100, which explored various seminal events in Ireland's journey. The passion with which President Higgins' written outputs are infused is also reflected in his work as a politician. He is a human rights advocate, a campaigner for food security, a champion of creativity, and a promoter of peace and democracy within Irish society and in many other parts of the world. His global efforts saw him become, in 1992, the first recipient of the Sean McBride Peace Prize from the International Peace Bureau in Helsinki. And he was honored by the government of Chile in 2016 for his humanitarian work that contributed to the saving of thousands of lives under the Pinochet regime. He is, in short, a deep thinker and a truly remarkable man. The lecture this evening is entitled, "Of the Consciousness Our Times Need in Responding to Interacting Crises, and the Role of Universities as Spaces of Discourse in Facilitating It." The President will touch on themes including the migratory experience, the importance of food security, and how universities provide grounds for thinking freely and empower students to think freely for the betterment of society, especially their own societies. Now, once President Higgins has given his lecture, there will be a Q&A session moderated by Professor McAuliffe. And for those watching online, arrangements are in place for you to submit questions using Slido. Please use the code #PresidentOfIreland. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is with immense pride and pleasure that I introduce to you the President of Ireland, Dr. Michael D. Higgins.
A hail sé iana uisle iliog agus daltaí agus locht teagas na hilscre sé cuirann sé áthas anam Verás in alscal agus ag tuairt leacht agus mar in sin rite hir ni imian go Joe. May I say, distinguished guests, and I'm so pleased that I'm accompanied on this visit by the Irish ambassador, Martin Fraser, and also by the Secretary General of my own department and many other members, some members of indeed the Consul General, to whom correct tribute has been paid already, and many others. And I might just say in Irish, gum weakest liviliokas and firkin fortune Irish Rome, Hayanos, Mafan Kela Sivin, is it a toitias the lum. I'm accompanied by my wife Sabina, and as I have just said in Irish, I want to say how grateful I am for the reception that I and Sabina and those travelling with us have received here in Manchester. I want to thank the Registrar, Patrick Hackett. I want to thank you for your kind words of introduction. And may I say that I appreciate the honour that has been given to me in being asked to give the inaugural lecture of this series, sponsored by that great friend of the university, John Kennedy, who I'm delighted is here with us and who is a good friend. And particularly a series that is celebrating 200 years of scholarship. I spoke at this university in 2012 when I gave a lecture entitled Thinking of Manchester and its Irish Connection. So it's a great honour to return again to this university as President of Ireland. And the lecture this evening is on the consciousness of our times, the consciousness of our time's need in responding to interacting crises and the role of universities as spaces of discourse in facilitating it. It was, of course, a great honour to have been conferred yesterday with an honorary Doctor of Letters, for which I'm deeply honoured, as I have said, the privilege it is to give the inaugural lecture in the new John Kennedy lecture in the lecture series. And when I think about it as well, it is that I studied here at Manchester half a century ago, 50 years ago. Now, I have to just maybe say an understatement. It was quite different. I recall from my time at the University of Manchester a list of distinguished names, be it students of academic staff. I think, for example, of the person to whom I was working my supervisor was J. Clyde Micheal, who became Manchester's first professor of social anthropology in 1949. Max Gluckman and Emery Peters were distinguished scholars in the anthropology department. Bruce Kapfer was coming on stage. And I had a dear friend, Valdo Pons, whom my lecture in 2012, I drew very much on Valdo's work on the writing about Manchester in the mid-19th century. See, this is how it goes in a way. You celebrate 200 years of the university, from 1824 to 2024. But also you must remember, 1821 is the cholera outbreak. And 1832 is the publication of a very significant pamphlet on the condition of the Irish in Manchester. And also, of course, as well, it becomes what is a compassionate volume, becomes abused as a major text of discrimination and prejudice and exclusion. I think of that time as well. There were distinguished people from others, Norman Long, who really, Norman made an immense contribution to social subjects in his critique, which became one of the most used books internationally, was his critique of the modernization theory, or more accurately, the modernization myth. Now, such scholars were, of course, preceded by fine scholarship. And indeed, I have read and looked at the fine scholars who've come after them, such as James Nazu, the current professor of sociology, whom I compliment for his important work on inequality and social justice. So today Manchester University is a very significant educational institution, a student body of over 46,000, 5,300 faculty staff. So it is a very impressive institution. And I would like to begin by wishing all who come and study here success and happiness in their studies. Students are important. I take the occasion of acknowledging as well the Irish who work here at the university, including Dr. John McAuliffe, Professor of Poetry at the Centre for New Writing, who I'm delighted is with us this evening. I think I might begin by saying something about that experience of 50 years ago, my own personal experience here. I have to say the term city Manchester, while later I would hear words ring like the spinning Jenny and all of that industrial Manchester. But in County Clare, we first heard of Manchester in a way. I was living in County Clare, and it was in the atmosphere of the 1950s. And between 1955 and 1960, 250,000 Irish people emigrated mostly to England because America was closed. And I think I lived near a railway station, Ballycorn, Newmarket and Fergus. And from that station, so many would go on the train, the emigration train to Dunleary and on then to Holyhead. And my sisters, who were twins at 19, 20 years of age, read of an advertisement from British Rail where they supplied you with a job, but also with accommodation in a hostel near where you would be working. And that is my connection with Manchester, the immigration of half my family, what I would describe maybe later in a literary sense as the scattering. We were beginning our scattering. And indeed they married and reared families in Manchester, in Oldham and here. And I think, when I think about that, I spoke about it, I think about those 1950s, but also very, very much in much more detail in my 2012 lecture. And that lecture, I was very grateful, in fact, that Professor McAuliffe published it at the time in the Manchester Review. And I think this, therefore, I need only briefly refer to it. But what does it mean? I stayed with my sister when I came in 1968. I was a postgraduate student. They had not really heard of Irish people doing postgraduate work in anthropology, social anthropology, sociology. And I do remember a rather memorable phrase after the Wednesday seminar with Bruce Camp, in fact, sitting near Bruce Campfire, and I think Max Gluckman would say, as we walked out, "Michael, you must tell us someday about your own people." I think that when I came therefore, I lived in Corby Street, just across from Bellevue. I don't think it exists anymore. And therefore I moved between two worlds. I moved between the world of my brother-in-law, drove, when work was available, heavy machinery. And when work wasn't available, he operated in a scrapyard. And that family, I moved, therefore, every day from Corby Street to Dover Street, where you had the Department of Government, Semi-Final, which of course, interestingly, had a military section, and I also then in the Department of Anthropology. I have to say that it's the most valuable time of my life. The scholarship and the conceptual innovation, the discussion, particularly from people like Clyde Micheal, and very particularly from Valdo Pons, who not only later became an external examiner at the National University of Ireland in Galway. I think when moving, I must say, and it's something I wish was studied more in universities, about the experience of strangeness. If you were from my background, and given there was a lot more to it than that, how would you find being in such a little set of competing contradictions? After all, in the anthropology department, people had either arrived home from Africa, been sent home from Africa, or chosen to leave Africa because the background of the work, including some of the most significant work, was at places called the Rhodes Livingston Institute and so on. I was aware of the quality of that work. But I think the anthropologists were now home in Dover Street, and they would set about using the tools that they had for studying the Xhosa and the Azande and others on the urban populations, their own urban populations. There were radical works around at the time. I remember Cliff Slaughter's work, Coal is Our Life, and what was happening to coal communities. Such work would lead later to studies of networks among urban dwellers. Such publications, before I left, I remember Social Networks in Urban Situations was published indeed by the Manchester University Press. Thus a methodology crafted, as I have said, for studying the Azande and the Xhosa and the Barotse came to be applied in industrial settings and urban communities in the Midlands as sites of research. That early work was extensive, influenced as well, which hasn't been noted sufficiently, by the fact that so many of the anthropologists, their training was a legal training, so thus their access to communities was very much in their research was an understanding conflict and disputes. There was beautiful work too. Of course, I think Clyde Mitchell's Kelela dance and others looking through the movements in the dance, what it told you about structure. I have to say, Master Friend, a man I would know later was Erskine Childers III, who was in fact working that time for the BBC. And he wrote of how these ceremonies of leaving Africa were being managed. The lights would go down in a stadium so that you wouldn't see the British flag being lowered. And then the lights would come on as the flag of the new country was raised. And the BBC commentator would say, and thus a new country joins the ranks of other countries, free to make its own mistakes. I think Erskine Childers objected to Mr. Temple, but the very first that he wrote about it afterwards in a monograph called Amnesia at Midnight. And from this period I developed an ever deeper interest through Vanderpoons in urban sociology, and above all else in migration and migrants. And for years afterwards, and I say it now here in Manchester, I was deeply indebted, as I've said, for the conceptual work of J. Clyde Micheal, Vanderpoons, and Peter Worsley, and David Morgan, and others, whom you've named correctly, a building after, I think, in the Morgan building, and others. They'd introduced me to both in terms of theoretical models derived from migration studies in Africa and their own research of the experience of migrants from tribal settings. I mentioned Clyde's beautiful Kelela dance and his very important seminal work on the causes of labour migration. Valdo's study had been Stanleyville, and of course his later contemporary interpretations of Manchester's in the 1830s and 40s included a valuable critique of Engels, who described the Irish as uncivilized, and also the work of James Philip Kay. Kay is the doctor to whom I refer to, who did the study and whose work was later misused. Then there's Cook Taylor and Richard Parkinson's comments on Manchester's life and industrialism. But I think that the Irish in those narratives I've spoken about it elsewhere, in many cases, they're here that I think the first big migration from Northern Ireland into the Spenning area, and then much later you had, of course, the post-famine migration. But sticking with, as I have said, the reconstruction of the atmosphere at the time, what was university life like? Well, it was exciting. There was the usual divisions. I recall in the Students' Union vigorous discussions amongst those of us on the left, Some people had read Althusser and they found it very difficult to talk to Labourites or the syndicalist-minded who were perceived as not dealing adequately with the consequences of concepts such as hegemony or mode of production. And then at other times, the two communist parties would face off against each other, some supporting Berlinguer's Italian revisionism, pitted against those who read the Daily Worker, and conversations were brightened by such valuable questions as, who do you report to, and do you sell the paper? But there were moments of great unity among us too from the student union. Everyone on the left, I recall, combined on a splendid occasion leaving the Students' Union to go to Salford to protest at Enoch Powell's appearance as the guest of the Tory party. I remember at this time as well, Roy Hattersley was beginning his political career, where I had to move later on in Wythenshawe. But I think most interesting to me was at meetings in Ardwick Green, where people who in the old language we refer to as little old lady, and now would be regarded as senior female citizens, were in fact in defending Harold Wilson from what they was perceived to be the challenge of Michael Foot, who was from a proud Labour tradition. I think Harold, in fact, who had just spoken of the white heat of technology and the immense possibilities of a technological future. On Foot, on the other hand, stressing a proud Labour tradition of organised labour and the struggle of the unions over history. And 1968 was that kind of year, a formative year of hope in so many parts of the world, a moment of emancipation and liberation, and even in the global north and the atmosphere of le trente glorieux of the capitalist world, and in the relative if oppressive stability of the Eastern Bloc, people young and old were imagining, writing and discussing in private and public gatherings new emancipatory possibilities. In May 1968, student protests in the Sorbonne, dismissed by French ministers as the mere outburst of libertines, spread across France to become a 2-week general strike as millions of workers seized their factories in an explosion of imagination and aspiration. In August 1968, the people of Prague took part in hundreds of acts of nonviolent resistance against a Soviet invasion designed to crush the liberalizing initiatives of the Czech government. I recall discussing with Václav Havel this and thinking about how he often spoke is that he wished he could recover the energy of that period for his later work. In all of this agitation, the organized labor of trade unions played a crucial role. I have to say trade unions had been important to me since my teens and all through my adult life. And I remember when I was appointed with the 1966 free education in secondary education in Ireland, brought a rush of new people to the universities. The embargo on hiring was lifted and a number of people, including myself, were hired. I remember there is a very image of myself at one stage standing in front of the university with a sign, Stalker Bonansha, strike on here. But our strike was not about the wages or about, our strike was about the right of the new young teachers to have the say in constructing the reading lists of the subjects in the courses in which we taught, of the right to have access to faculty and so forth. And I ran a campaign recruiting for the union, the Workers' Union of Ireland, Union of Ireland Teaching Section. I was in favour of it because the people on the grounds were in the union, the general union. Kader Asmal was recruiting for the Irish Federation of University Teachers. And after we finished our round of the country, he more or less got everyone from associate professor up, and I got a couple of hundred people who were below that level. And the union still exists. I'm very proud that in relation to that. In our contemporary times, I think it is no harm to think in a way about how, if you like, discussion of our rights of work and access and publication. They arose in 1969. I remain a member. I have never broken my related with Workers' Union of Ireland. Would later become SIPTU, one of Ireland's largest trade unions, and my wife's union, the Actors' Union, and we both end up in the same general union. Trade unions have played such an important role in history and continue to do so, delivering transformative societal change, and they're so relevant in our present circumstances. In our contemporary times, therefore, and I end with this preliminary, it is good to recall the atmosphere and emancipatory potential that shone in that year of 1968, and how it came and went. The utopian vision and the belief in the capacity of non-violent political movements to achieve transformative change are required now more than ever, not only to confront the residues, revival, and invocation of racism, xenophobia, inequality, and injustice, not only to continue the stand for the dignity and rights of every human being, but also to confront the great new challenges and interacting crises of our coming century, the consequences of climate change, biodiversity loss, and a redirection of economies, the urgent need to redirect economies towards the sustainable development for all peoples. This will require a vindication, I suggest, of old rights and the articulation and winning of new ones. Above all, it requires a new spirit of global solidarity, such as the spirit demonstrated by the civil rights movement of over 50 years ago. The times in which I studied in Manchester were exciting times of hope and promise, times of emancipatory scholarship and literature. And as I prepared this lecture, as a reminder to me, it seemed, of Thomas Merton's version of the serendipity of books. The book that fell to me was not a political tract, but a Fontana paperback, The Future of Man, by Jesuit physicist Teilhard de Chardin, that great Christian humanist, somebody whom this university has honored, I think, by naming a building after him. That set of papers, delivered in the 1940s by Chardin, published in French in the 1950s and in English in 1964, spoke of the imaginative significance of some basic principles of physics, and above all, to what an evolution, a state of human consciousness signified, and to what it might evolve. Teilhard's concept of the omega point, that of a universe ever evolving towards a maximum state of complexity and consciousness, towards a new point of balance that delivered, as he hoped and suggested, an inevitable peace, is an uplifting concept that has in its time been cited far and wide, including in literature. Flannery O'Connor's "Everything that rises must converge" is a clear reference to Chardin's work. And I must ask, are we to abandon the project then of achieving peace in diversity? Is lasting peace achievable? Teilhard de Chardin answered in The Future of Man, I quote, "Despite all appearances to the contrary, mankind is not only capable of living in peace, but by its very structure cannot fail eventually to achieve peace. Peace shows us two complementary faces. First, a steep slope only to be climbed by constant effort in the face of many setbacks, and ultimately the point of balance to which the whole system must inevitably come." And he went on to suggest that the concord that must therefore of necessity eventually prevail on earth will take the form of, I quote, "some sort of tense cohesion pervaded and inspired with the same energies which were previously wasted in bloodshed. It will have unanimity in search and conquest, sustained among us by the universal resolve to raise ourselves upwards, all straining shoulder to shoulder towards even greater heights of consciousness and freedom." The literature of 68 and some decades to follow, to which Chardin's work gave such impetus, suggests true peace invites to a fulfilling project for humankind, constitutes a realization of humanity's potential to become finally alive to realize the possibilities and demands of its evolution. It echoes an immense body of writing that can be found in the history of most cultures. Why is it then that we find ourselves at this very moment, 2024, still so painfully incapable of agreeing among ourselves? Why does the threat and promulgation of war still appear so menacing and widespread? Why do we accept failure in diplomacy and almost regard war as a natural inevitability? Is it because those who hold power and head the institutions which serve them still have not purged themselves sufficiently of that which Paulin de Chardin called the demon of immobilism? Or could it be that the underlying antagonism which separates those at the conference table represents, as he put it, the eternal conflict between motion and inertia, the cleavage between one part of the world that moves and another that does not seek to advance? How then might we muster a heightened consciousness to challenge a dangerous and divisive immobilism, enable in passing fulfilling relationships, enable resonance with each other? As some new original sociologists are writing, such as Professor Hartmut Rosa of Jena University, when he argued in his book for examining how we resonate with each other. And then I ask, what role does the university as an institution have in enabling such an evolution of consciousness? I suggest that achieving our new point of equilibrium requires us to rekindle our faith in the possibilities, in Irish we would say na féidearthachtaí, not yet realized of humanity, in each other, our faith that good things are achievable, that peace is possible, and that is even our natural condition, that to which we evolve. Rather than competing in siren calls for an increasing defense budgets across the world, we might work to develop a greater consciousness of the existential plight facing humankind, of life as it is being lived and experienced, seek to provide an institutional framework that sees difference as not necessarily being threatening, but rather as an opportunity for an enriching cooperation towards shared goals. As to that immobilism of which de Chardin spoke, an example might be of how an unquestioned block of scholarship, with its assumptions left untested, can be a source of not only immobilism, but serve as rationalization of neoclassicism. For example, in neoclassicism in the social sciences, offering something that resists critique while being at the same time an uncriticized hegemonic source of policy. I recall in the 1960s, when I was a young student at Indiana University, I was encouraged to concentrate on what was suggested as the seminal texts on development theory and practice, on a set of studies that were concentrated on industrialism as an endpoint of successful human achievement and development. And thus began my encounter with modernization theory, pillared as it was on such foundational texts of those of the Princeton studies of Hammond and Verba, Huntington and Lucian Boyd, David McClelland and others. I think that these would be so valuably critiqued by a scholar here in Manchester, Norman Long, later. Their shared model consisted of a simple division of the world, originally between developed and traditional countries, and would be later extended to create a continuum where characteristics of modernizing potential were contrasted with inhibiting traditional factors to an inevitable prosperous alternative industrial society. The balance found by the authors in examination decided a people's position in the continuum. Through this culturally ethnocentric, linear, and reductionist prism, so valuably, as I have said, critiqued by Norman Long, one was invited to study the sources of one's own people's backwardness, as Orlando Falls-Bode famously wrote at the time. Those seminal texts from Princeton University Press shaped sociological teaching for many years, particularly where sociology was being introduced as a new subject. And they would travel in airplanes around the world as different people fell as well into the single one trap of development. I remember meeting a scholar of my time saying, God, I've dug out the old lectures I never thought they'd be useful again. And off he went in the 1990s. And the existential challenge that faces us today, be it global hunger, malnutrition and poverty, sustainability, biodiversity loss, climate change, they all require us to arrive at a new enhanced consciousness, a new point of balanced concord resonance, as in fact Chardin would put it, an agreement as to the means and strategies of survival itself. The writings of which I have referred were part, that is, on a consciousness of promoting a consciousness that sought peace, recognized interdependence. It all emanated shortly, remember, after the time of the foundation of the United Nations, of a seemingly shared aspiration towards making war unnecessary, of global peaceful coexistence, a period of deep reflection. And it included reflection on the evolution of human consciousness itself, of what it was, and of achieving a balance between individuation and the purpose of others. This was a subject that engaged Gottfried Leibniz, Carl Jung, Friedrich Nietzsche, and of course Schopenhauer, amongst others. And they are all contributing so much in their differing approaches. It was a time of burgeoning scientific and technological discovery, accompanied by a not inconsiderable hubris. The debate on how science and technology might impact on society was very much a secondary consideration. And I spoke of the confrontation at Ardwick Green. If it was a consideration at all, Howard Wilson's speech in Manchester University on the white heat of technology took a hubristic tone. And I was so often later to be struck by the similarities of tone and such hubris in that speech given hundreds of years earlier by Francis Bacon as part of the generation of the myth of progress. Bacon wrote, I lead to you nature with all her children, to bind her to your service and make her your slave. Gouge out her secrets. The legacies of an uncritical approach to the science-technology-society debate has led to desperate choices in societies where fear has replaced hope or possibility of cooperation, to a competitive pursuit of ever more deadly instruments of war and mass destruction. Indeed, now, the capacity of destruction of lives and settings without identification and with impunity. The growing dominance of the military-industrial complex in parts of the global economy, itself a legacy of such surrender to technos and the abandonment of the discourse of peace and nonviolence as ideals and instruments of harmonious living. Is there a possibility of achieving what I've been talking about, the consciousness of which Chardin's work and the questions it poses? Can we move past points of blockage, be they conscious or unconscious, to real emancipatory progress in realizing the possibilities of the fulfillment of our human potential? Can we move on from ideological biases so inherent in foundational work that informed hegemonic models in our scholarship, such as that I mentioned the Princeton studies did in development economics? And I think, too, as did an authoritarian excess in state power abuses in places that defeated collective endeavors of cooperation, I think the universalism of human need and capacity, which not form part of that consciousness of which I speak as alternative, is a contested term now. It is one that has been the source of competing versions too. But at this stage of my life, when I look back at my time in Manchester and teaching sociology in different places, I think of a wonderful example for us all. I think of the version advocated by Richard Titmuss, the former professor of social policy at the London School of Economics, and arguably one of the key intellectual theorists of that great human achievement that is the British welfare state and National Health Service. His was one symbolized by a culture of social solidarity, one that was formed by institutions, as I have said, to the National Health Service, providing as it did publicly funded hospital care for soldiers returning from war. His vision included a public version of social insurance, and later he entered all the debates on pension security. The version of universalism which Titmuss elucidated in his seminal 1970 book, The Gift Relationship, constituted little less than a manifesto, inter alia, on the advantages of a free health system over a privatized version, on how altruism binds societies together. I often think that he would have been mentioning really how that difference between the neglected Asclepian model of care. I think it is very interesting, too, that the important aspects of healthcare which he addressed, he suggested that the concentration should be on what was more difficult to measure. For example, people's capacity to care for each other. And in Titmuss's work, right to his death in a public hospital, in speaking about the glory of ending one's life, where everyone was being treated equally by the most modern medicine. The gift relationship was but one of so many influential texts of the time as which I speak that have proved powerful tools in the analysis of welfare provision. Titmuss's analysis is even more relevant now in an age of financialized healthcare policy, at a time too when health and welfare systems are under sustained attack from so many quarters. In my lecture at Manchester University in 2012, I spoke of the experience of the Irish in Manchester, and how another great man, James Philip Kay, wrote of their condition, but his sympathetic, empathetic work came to be used as a tool against the poorest people of the Irish in Manchester. And I have to think that in all of my own experience as a migrant studying migration at the end of the 60s and through the 70s and 80s was long after the great tidal waves of those Irish arrivals at midpoint in the end of the 19th century. And they were coming into an atmosphere too, because standing in their historical background was the infamous Manchester outrage, in which three Irish nationalists, William Philip Allen, Michael Larkin, and Michael O'Brien, known as the Manchester Martyrs, were hanged in 1867, following their conviction for murder of a police officer in Manchester. And there were difficult times to come. There was a horrific Manchester bomb in 1996, and another later again. The warm-hearted people of Manchester would have the Manchester Arena bombings of May 2017. I think how we should be grateful we are in better times. But long before my years at Manchester University, in the late 1960s, I had been familiar with the migratory experience of the Irish in Britain. I had a particular interest from my own summer work in Sussex. I was pre-grant at University College Galway when I went later to university. One had to win scholarships, but I worked every summer in England, and that proved to be more than viable. But I recall writing my very first letter to a newspaper was to the London Evening Standard, which had produced what would not be its last racist comment on the Irish. And I remember when I wrote in 1962, and the owner of the hotel in Sussex said to me, "When you're writing to the papers again, would you mind not mentioning the name of the hotel?" Now, but migrants elsewhere, I only mention this, is that migrants have always been at particular risk from gross stereotyping, regarded as marginal people, insufficiently grateful, reluctant to acknowledge the virtues of the point of destination to which they've arrived, forgetting their origins and practices, unwilling to assimilate. The stereotype stage depiction of the Irishman is as old as the first production of Sir Robert Howard's The Committee, produced in 1662 on the Restoration stage. And it is a stereotype that would continue through the centuries thanks to racist and homophobic Punch cartoons. But I think about how have sociologists handled migration. The structural functionalism within the social sciences suffered from a terrible sedentary bias. The assumption was that people were in one place, but they didn't move. But of a failure, and thus migrants were always being acted upon. And the Irish study of 1948-51 suggests about they being pushed by circumstances at home and pulled by attraction elsewhere. But there was no such thing as migrant agency. And thus you had a limited perspective that missed what is the very heart of the migratory experience, transience. Transience at the heart of the act of migration. And then the universality of the act of migration, of movement, has neither been given due regard in either scholarship or policy. I have to say that one of the current members of staff of Manchester University, Professor Liam Hart's book, The Literature of the Irish in Britain, aged 1725-2001, does indeed give a powerful agency to the migrants. These are migrants writing not just to be regarded as literature, but migrants writing so that their experience will be acknowledged and not forgotten. And that's a splendid book to which I referred in 2012. And I'm falling into my habit now, falling back into other references, and I'm going to stick to my text. But if any of you want to open your sandwiches, you can do so now. But the United Nations Commissioner, speaking of migrants in our current circumstances, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, speaking recently of the growing hostility towards people on the move, and reflecting on 40 years of experience, has written as follows: "I have never seen such toxicity, such poison in the language of politics, in the media, in social media, and even in everyday discussions and conversations around this issue. This toxicity often focuses, sadly, tragically, on refugees, migrants, and foreigners, and that should be of concern to us all. That we have sunk as a species to this level, that those with an authority and experience are driven to put it like that, in language like that, represents little less than a damning indictment of our present circumstances. Regrettably, we are losing, be it through a consciousness tendered mute, broken, made weary, alienated, anomic, and at times perhaps obsessed with the very struggle for survival, in a world of spiraling inequality, controllable but uncontrolled capitalism. What is lost is one of the most fundamental tenets of our humanity, the capacity to share the vulnerability as well as the security of the other in conditions of transition in space and time. The artistic response to migration, on the other hand, has shown an understanding which sociology has so often missed. Art is revelatory in what it can capture, of what formal studies can overlook. The exhibition in this university's Whitworth Gallery on forced migration and displacement offers a nuanced, complex story driven by artists with lived experiences who have had the insight, the creative imagination, and the resilience with which to share their own stories. They open out the vision on migration and shift our collective thinking away from a fixation with crisis, boats, tents, and mobile peoples, towards acknowledging histories that are simply incomplete. We are all migrants in time. Migration has been the natural condition of humankind as long as historical facts have been recorded. The benefits of such migration in every age have been of such importance, not least in scholarship. The migratory soul is a curious soul, a creative one, as the writings of migrants show. Offering then a multidisciplinary understanding of migration is surely a most important, appropriate project within the consciousness of universities. After all, the consciousness for which universities were established to achieve might cultivate with a mix of reflection, reflexivity, and concerned compassion. It must be always nurtured from an instinct grounded in the betterment of society, in sustaining not only humanity's advance in addressing challenges, but in opening opportunities for a shared fulfillment of life for which good scholarship is critical to the ongoing pursuit of a more just, peaceful, inclusive, sustainable world. And I'm well aware that universities have been undergoing enormous upheaval over a number of years as they assumed superiority of a neoliberal agenda in the service of a suggested urgent, inescapable neo-utilitarianism has seeped into not just the administration and bureaucracy of higher education, but into what constituted the setting for teaching and the possibilities for fundamental research, the sharing of scholarship and inspirational teaching, indeed the very ethos of university life itself. This is a circumstance that is sourced in a profound, uncritical acceptance of neo-functionalism, one that has prioritized the commodification of the learning experience, a near obsession with the necessity of demonstrating an empirically demonstrable efficiency with scant regard for a more generally judged effectiveness, be it socially or more widely defined, productivity, value for money, and other metrics that have been narrowly defined and measured, but not always been transparent or evaluated properly, and too often at the expense of real deep learning, of memorable teaching that can be genuinely emancipatory for the student and scholar. When I wrote about this a few years ago, I was often reflecting back to Weber's nightmare of a rationality that in time would counter the original purposes of institutions, that would morph into an irrational form, incapable of adjustment to change internally or externally. And I think it is difficult to cast it away as an account of the contemporary period. Weber saying, "It is not the brightness of spring that beckons, but the continuation of the icy cold fingers of winter." In periods of such hegemonic domination, even those with high intellectual qualifications can find themselves acting as an immobilizing force, of which Chardin made reference. One only has to recall the example I've offered of the influence of the Princeton studies in their day on the sociology of development, on modernization theory in general. What seeks hegemony often within an educational institution is a set of influences, some uncritically taken for granted, and some may be sourced externally, others internally. The list of external influences on the academy, which have manifested as a series of profound concerns facing universities in recent times, has been well enumerated by many, including Keith Thomas. In the recent issue of the London Review of Books, he pointed to issues such as the discontinuance of free university education as citizenship right, the withdrawal of direct public funding for the teaching of the humanities and the social sciences, the subjection of universities to an intrusive regime of government regulation and inquisitorial audit. Lovely phrase, that. The crude attempt to measure and increase scholarly output. The requirement that all academic research have an impact on the economy. And then there may be also what I might call the internal constraints within the academy, further versions of Chardin's immobilizers, reflected in a bias towards the measurable and a creeping over-specialization that serves what is the current demand rather than the full range of possibilities. And when it comes to university ethos, Edward Said said he offered an example of John Henry Newman as an argument against the consequences of over-specialization. Indeed, he suggested that the model of academic freedom should be the migrant or traveler. We should be free to discover and travel among other selves, other identities, other varieties of the human adventure, but most essentially in this joint discovery of self and others, it is the role of the academy to transform what might be conflict or contest or assertion into reconciliation, mutuality, recognition, and creative interaction. Said's model was founded on the concept of the scholar as explorer in pursuit of knowledge and freedom for public benefit. It allows for a contrast of the academic model of the professional who seeks to be king and potentate with the traveller who is dependent not on power but motion, willing to enter different worlds. I quote, use different idioms, understand a variety of disguises, masks, and rhetorics. Indeed, as James C. Scott applied such a model in his theoretical work on peasant strategies of defense. The traveller, free in spirit and unshackled, embraces novelty and avoids predetermined paths, crossing over to the space of the other. And such a paradigm is the cultural idiom of academic freedom, but it also embodies the emancipatory essence of an inclusive and democratic society. So we are thus, perhaps, at a perilous juncture in the long history of the academy. Universities, as sites, sources, and experiences of learning, have for several decades now been under continuous attack from a variety of sources, some overt, others covert. Universities are widely and regularly reporting a sense of an attrition of range and depth, loss of interdisciplinary exchange, leading in many cases to a degradation of the very scholarship and teaching for which they were established. Such adjustments, when accepted, have usually been rationalized to the public as an inevitable search for relevance, often as unavoidable responses to market forces. Such capitulation to perceived contemporary demands, even by its own narrow measures, can miss much of what is possible as well as important. Geoffrey Boulton and Colin Lucas recently wrote of an earlier time, the 1930s. A good example in this concept was Roosevelt's 1937 Foresight Commission, established to advise on the most likely innovations of the succeeding 30 years. The Commission not only identified many unrealized technologies, but it also missed nuclear energy, lasers, computers, jet engines, sonar, antibiotics, pharmaceuticals, the genetic code, and many more. In addition, the scientists who studied climate change in the 1970s were, of course, in their time, regarded as irrelevant. In our current circumstances of increasingly fractured polities, universities are also increasingly subjected to polarizing criticism, even as they preserve spaces that protect free speech. However, any adequate discussion of our present circumstance must now consider not just the loss of academic freedom at the level of the individual scholar. I suggest they should consider the loss of the institution, of the ethos of a university itself, and of the space of university discourse. Universities, in their free-thinking mode, are a vital resource for the future, and the crisis we face is an intellectual one within a moral context. It reflects how, for example, in the subjects now taught as economics, as we have passed from moral economy through political economy to a technical training in measurement and evaluation, for which we have neither adequate theory nor scholarly methodology. I recall that it was in 1968 that the first movements for change in the teaching of economics that would allow for normative perspectives started in Manchester, was shared in Oxford, and then travelled to Paris. This approach was not widespread, nor did it last. But we're coming out of a dark period in bad teaching of limited versions of economics, and it is welcome when decades of Keynesianism for now gave way in policy influence. They had given way to decades influenced by the theories of those such as Friedrich von Hayek, who favoured unrestrained market dominance. That largely uncontested paradigm is one that emerged triumphant for a while, but it is a paradigm that has had profound consequences for institutions, including universities. A paradigm that made assumptions and demands as to the connection between scholarship, politics, economy, and society. It was deeply divisive and exclusionary in its consequences that have not disappeared. The public world is now again a space of contestation, as the great philosopher Jürgen Habermas has articulated so well, but is less well served by public discourse than when he first wrote on this topic, because of our further surrender to technos at the cost of anti-intellectualism. It is a space that has set that which is democratic in its accountability in an unavoidable tension with that which is unaccountable in its power or consequences. And thus we are all morally challenged to engage with the recovery of democratic accountability. So much ground has been lost in terms of what Habermas coined the public sphere, the public world, the shared essential space of an independent people, free to participate and change their circumstance, to imagine their better futures. So the academy is morally challenged, I believe, whether to drift into be part of a consensus that accepts the legacy of a failed narrow paradigm of existence, or to offer or seek to recover, drawing on its rich scholarly tradition, at its best moments of disputation and discourse, alternatives that offer with energy a democratic, liberating, creative, and sustainable future with potential emancipatory outcomes, deeper consciousness, and what was always there in the old philosophy, human flourishing. Universities are challenged once again, and with energy displayed within and outside the walls, to embrace and foster the role of critical citizen, drawing on a sense of history, encouragement, facilitating imagination, disputing taken for granted assumptions of competing hegemonic models of narrow utility. What is now needed is the seeking of the space, the capacity, the community of scholarship necessary to robustly defend the free, critical, scholarly university tradition and challenge, for example, such reductive paradigms of connection between economy and society, ethics and morality, democratic discourse and authoritarian imposition that have failed so miserably. But I believe that universities can lead in privileging a new global consciousness that calls for new paradigms of engagement with the world, contribute meaningfully to the discourse on the present challenges of our day, be it the crisis in democracy, the ecological crisis, the humanitarian crisis, global hunger, poverty, or the privileging of war at the expense of peace and multilateral engagement. May I suggest that all of these issues are fundamentally based on how we take each other into account, be it by averting our gaze or celebrating together our differences, vulnerabilities, and anxieties of interdependency, how we may seek to resonate with each other, if I might quote again Professor Rosa. All of these suggestions are about reclaiming the university as a space for curiosity and of energy, a space that can accommodate strangeness and even eccentricity, a space itself that is a source of ethics. I recall myself the curiosity which fed the desire to be inside the walls of a university before I had the capacity to do so, and the strangeness when I went in the gate. I recall the power of collective disputation and action within it as a student, and the great sheer privilege of what it was to come to be a university teacher, teaching curious students, so many of whom would go on to be friends, colleagues, and make their own contribution. I'm asked sometimes, are you hopeful then? I resist being driven back to any Adorno-esque pessimism. Yet that seminal 1941 essay by Herbert Marcuse, Social Implications of Modern Technology, remains a cautionary and prophetic account of all those dimensions of technical reason open to repressive and ideological utilization in the hands of authoritarian regimes. Too much of it has come to be. But yet, despite this, I believe that a university response which is critically open to originality in theory and research, committed to humanistic values in teaching, is open to heterodoxy, has a unique opportunity to make a global contribution of substance to the great challenges we face, and that such a university will come to be celebrated in the future by generations as the hub of original critical thought and science, and a promoter of their application through new models of interconnection between science, technology, administration, and society. And that also by using established tools of scholarship for new purposes, even in ways that can help make redress for the mistake and damage of centuries in the past. Is it too late? I hope not. It will take a release of emancipatory energy to turn matters around, to save the university experience as one of originality, wonder, performance, awe, and the shared joy of scholarship and enhanced consciousness. Universities, I think, have a crucial role in creating a society in which there will be an openness to consideration and critical exploration of alternatives to any prevailing hegemony for the betterment of society. And it requires academics to feel free to seize moments, to have the courage to provide suitable reaction, to be subversive of received thought, assumptions and fallacies, to have a shared consciousness, to tackle the great issues facing us, and to critique hegemony. In that developing of an evolved consciousness, I suggest that must include a robust response to rising, deepening global hunger, malnutrition, poverty, famine, avoidable pandemics. We must allow power to transfer to the peopled planet. That will be a huge, huge act of consciousness. Allow the peopled planet to use their resources to serve their essential needs and make a global contribution that they will decide. And if I might suggest towards the end then, a practical project that I believe might have special relevance for Manchester University and its tradition. It is by making a return to the use of theoretical and applied anthropological fieldwork and scholarship to help redress the failures of transparency in current development practice. For example, on the continent of Africa. Thank you. For example, the current discussion has opened up in Africa, and I have been part of it myself, between those who want an increase in industrial agriculture within existing international trade models versus alternative views to which I've contributed myself in papers at the World Food Summit in Rome and the Dakar Food Security Conference in Senegal, we sought in those papers to break food dependency and privilege smallholders of land and allow for the new innovations in agroeconomy and keep African land in African ownership. For example, among the alternatives is the much discredited De Soto model, which suggests that you must make the changes by granting titles that can be the collateral for bank loans, and therefore these can be bundled up and therefore people end up labouring in the fields they no longer own, as happened in Central America by the Grace Corporation with the so-called system of títulos of Professor de Soto, a bad and dangerous model. I believe it would be a valuable exercise in consciousness for the university in its present circumstances to be on the side of the smallholder in the future of Africa, be on the side of the women who are labouring in the fields, rather than on the side of the unaccountable seed or fertilizer monopoly, or those abusing, as I have said, the land title system to buy vast tracts of land for export of crop. And indeed, some of that land is being used not for feeding humans, but for feeding cattle. I think all of this to say, I like to work in cooperation and support all of the money that has been gathered for food security in Africa, but to do it in a way that is different, a way that does not serve an unaccountable international global corporation, but in fact can be made accountable by the tools of anthropology used in Manchester in the 19th century. In this century, bring anthropology back to Africa, allow Africans to construct how they can use this valuable tool as a means of critiquing how money is been spent allegedly for their benefit. And indeed it is meant for their benefit. I suggest that the powerful instrument of anthropology can be used to great effect, and that an emerging scholarship is there now, informed by evidence from below, emanating from new empirical peer-reviewed anthropology practiced by African scholars, helped by those who support them, and it offers the tools required to empower Africans and help re-equip multilateral institutions. Anthropology can read people economics, considerably hear of essential needs, offer responses that are appropriately respectful of what is received wisdom, what is complex and local, help intergenerational cohesion, encourage practitioners, facilitate democratic institutional practice. Then too, given the food insecurity and hunger are the drivers behind migration, the pursuit of food sufficiency represents a significant contributory factor to tackling dangerous forced migratory flows. A reconstituted anthropology can in its practices promote a powerful connection between people and place. It can constitute a people-directed response to breaking dependency and poverty, with a capacity for state building and the promotion of transitions to democracy. In its being people-focused, anthropology can nurture capacities in circumstances such as were envisaged in a Martha Sen's capabilities approach, thus creating opportunities for everyone to fulfill their potential, utilizing their talents and wisdoms. And such a new anthropological scholarship can assist, I believe, in achieving real emancipatory potential for new models of food production systems. And I can go further. I believe that failure to facilitate an inclusive ground-based consciousness of the food security crisis and to allow for a pluralism of approaches in teaching agricultural economics and development theory, and specifically food production, is a deprivation of students' basic rights, indeed citizen rights. Surely it is necessary to know and to understand the ontology and epistemology that underpin development models that have been so influential over the past 40 years and which have determined the lives of so many. Scholarship at its best, my last, is a shared achievement. And the social disciplines have nothing to lose by working imaginatively in the interstices, as Said put it in his foundational text, Orientalism. May I suggest that we return and privilege philosophy's crucial role in our universities. Philosophy can assist in our reconsideration of ethical dimensions in so many areas: public accountability, war and peace, trade, debt, food security, area. Can universities provide the source of hope necessary, creating the discourse for tackling climate change, global hunger, and enabling peace? Yes, they can. Academic freedom has never been a more important principle of the university ethos. It must be enshrined as a core enabling tenet of academia, a moral and legal protection underscoring the conviction that the freedom of inquiry by faculty members is essential to the mission and principles of the academy, and that scholars should have freedom to teach or communicate ideas or facts, including those that may be inconvenient to external political groups or funding authorities, without facing repercussions such as censorship, job loss, or even imprisonment. Michael Polanyi, in his great 1958 book, Personal Knowledge, stated that academic freedom was a fundamental necessity for the production of true knowledge, that a structure of liberty is essential for the advancement of science, and that the freedom to pursue scholarship for its own sake is a prerequisite for the production of knowledge through peer review and the scientific method. However, when the freedom being lost is not just the individual scholar, but the concept of the university itself, we are at a new level of threat. Could it be that scholars, threatened in securing their individual challenges, are failing to save the very institution itself beneath their feet? I believe universities are challenged now not only to recover the moral purpose of original thought, of deepening consciousness, of emancipatory scholarship, but not to lose the right or impulse to challenge those inevitabilities of thought and practice, such as that of conflict resolvable only by war. Inevitabilities that need to be questioned, but which in the changed circumstances of communication are immune from accountability or critical engagement. It is through such sharing of scholarship of ideas that we may share the joy of intellectual discovery that cooperation facilitates, even serendipitous discoveries, thus advancing the truly emancipatory potential of academia for society and for all of life. Ensuring that the fruits of academia can contribute solutions to the great global social, economic, and ecological challenges we face. Seek to advance possibilities of fulfillment for all that are there, beyond the narrow provision of a source of wealth for any single individual or corporation. And I agree with Professor Ginny Stevens, who writes that another form of university is possible, one beyond any narrow functionalism. Rather than continuing to reinforce an individualistic approach to academic success, universities could be contributing to the public good by shifting human societies onto a path towards a more sustainable, peaceful, inclusive future. By linking their scholarly missions with global solidarity and such climate justice, universities can expand their impact and relevance by connecting more directly with our diversity of community needs. So I believe that the emancipatory potential of universities is enormous, but perhaps they have allowed to become underutilized as a driving force for social change for public good, for the potential to support and hasten the transformative social, political, and economic changes we need. And there is an urgent need, of course, to resist the quiet capture of universities, overtly or covertly, by powerful elites and corporate interests. Will universities find the necessary courage? Will they seek the space, the capacity, the community of scholarship, of which is necessary to challenge such paradigms of the connection between economy, ecology, society, ethics, democratic discourse, and authoritarian imposition as have emerged? Will they, as alternative, drawing on their rich university tradition, recover moments of disputation and discourse again? Allow alternatives that propose a democratic, liberating, sustainable future? All I will say is the changes of which I speak and suggest is about recovering the right to pose the important questions, as Immanuel Kant, through the development of his form of transcendental realism of his time, did. What might we know? What should we do? What may we hope? And it was Raymond Williams who said, to be truly radical is to make hope possible, rather than despair convincing. And the title he gave to his very final paper was, Be the Arrow, Not the Target. And universities, I think, finally are best when they're living communities of scholarship and critical change, when they are sites for reflection, creativity, participation, and radicalism that can be invoked as better moments of their contribution to humanity. For those of us who had the privilege of being university teachers, and those who still are, The university is, I suggest, a space from which new futures can emerge, even utopian ideals of which the university community and students have so marched out together. We must all make this possible again with the greatest of urgency. It is a time to recover diversity of scholarship, unity of scholarly report, to strike out for originality. And out of a struggle, I think, for the recovery of the public world, the possibility of the emergence of truly emancipatory, connected paradigms of policy and research are visible on the location. I have to say, finally, and with your permission, I've been thinking about what I have said just now, about radicalism. I've been recalling my time as a student and as a young university teacher, a time when students and I so often at weekends shared a journey to a public space where we offered our views with anyone willing to listen. And I believe strongly that this was and is a valuable aspect of universities and the public system. And this is a spirit I sought to capture in one of the few poems I have written since I became President of Ireland. I wrote it in tribute to Mary McPartlin, singer, feminist lecturer and trade unionist, with whom I had shared many a stage in the past. And it was a poem, my poem is called Of Saturdays Made Holy. The night is long and I awake, struggling to recall the making of the march on those Saturdays made holy. The beat of feet behind banners that bore the glory of the words, the call for a life made equal. Banners held steady for the speech, gold-threaded, fringed, eyeletted with care, for the carrying to defeat the opposing breeze, borne by arms made strong, from work of mind, of heart and hand. Those words went out to cheers our search for now. They are not gone, nor is the memory of how they danced without restraint, skipping back and forth to cheers in joyful subversion of the ordinary. The echo of that beat of feet behind banners on Saturdays made holy is slow to come. Can it be that it is lost, perhaps forgotten? Surely not so, for in the long sweep of history and the stories that will be told, others will hear of how behind banners they marched, women and men, and children too, on Saturdays made holy. It will be told of how they sometimes won, but often lost, if never defeated. It will matter that they sometimes wept, unfolding for another day those banners that carried words emancipatory. The night, though long and dawn so sloken breaking, yet morning light glorious reveals how from those arrows fledged in history that missed their mark in darkness has sprung in light some frail fruit trees of hope. In other times an old planet weary finds new life, renewal from the music of the heart. And now a new song emerges from behind banners, gold-threaded, again made sacred, on Saturdays made holy, with words emancipatory, as the voices rise and sing of love and a new day for all humanity.
Thank you, President Higgins, for such an inspirational and thought-provoking lecture. You talked about being at a perilous moment in time, but I've taken a very strong message of hope from your lecture and a real call to action for our universities and all of us to protect, as you said, free, critical, scholarly tradition and to improve mutual understanding and achieve peace through discourse. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the President has very kindly agreed to stay on a bit longer so that we can have a question and answer session. And Professor John McAuliffe has joined us on stage to chair this section. Thank you, John.
That's a wonderful Wednesday evening made holy for us in memory. President Higgins, thank you so much. I suppose I am going to come to a question, but I wanted to say for those of us who walk around the university or who know of the Morgan Centre or know of the Micheal Centre in the School of Social Sciences here, it's wonderful to hear the backstory of these great scholars and the rich theme that they laid down for your own work and your own life, President Higgins. And what a vista we got, yes? What a vista of that amazing global perspective that you have. But I'm a poet here at the university, so I thought that I might begin by asking you about, I suppose, the poem you wrote at the end, but also why poems have mattered to you as a form of communication alongside your wonderful essays and scholarship.
Yeah. I think, first of all, what happens in poetry, even in that one, which is the reconstruction of a set of events, in a way, and their invocation, is there is a distillation. And the distillation means that you drop away anything that is simply that is unnecessary. But there's something else too in it, and that is that, like making a poem like that in many ways, you could, I hope, get the sense, for example, of the cheers and the sense of holding the text, of holding the material of the banners and that. Well, what in a way this does is, of course, is that sensory experience is sometimes limited by a verbal description. So if you like, the curiosity of the senses, and if you wanted to use it for really looking at larger, different poems that have had influence in my life and ones that I've been interested in, or others have, is that it flies past any barriers of rationality. If it isn't very much, in a way, you have to defeat Descartes, you see, there, yes. Because it is not the case at all. It is that what is felt and what has not been verbalized and what your senses are telling you, I think, is very important. And you have to allow those suggestions to arise. People working and making a poem, I remember in those collections, you then can get lucky, as you know, in relation when what I have described and the line fit. So therefore there is then its own way. It's making its music to you. So in the sound and the line and the theme of suddenly, and you sometimes, for example, get a gift. I wrote a poem, I remember, in honour of Brendan Kennelly in the Bottom member, when I say to it, when the muse visits, take her in, and so forth. And I think as well, and other poems, there's others about the effect on people, like, for example, the people coming back from the Peloponnesian War, explaining it in Athens, standing on a stone, and he begins, and what is he going to tell them? And they are getting excited, and you move, if you like, from the description, and then you move on, and the long history of that will give you theatre, from monologue to dialogue to the role of the chorus and so forth. But where I felt very much about it is that it is also, in a sense, there is a prescience in poetry as well, where in the same way as, for example, a dog will know that their owner is going away if they see the sight of a suitcase. In a similar way, the poetic instinct is an instinct that is reading the future, but also in another way, in a kind of, I mentioned Asclepius, it is looking at the wound and it isn't lifting its gaze from that. So that's how it all happens. But my poem, in a way, very, very much as well, is that when I was on the road with Mary McCart and others, she playing music, singing, and I reading poems and so forth, I've been very, very much in favour of the performed poem. And we discussed Thomas Kinsella earlier, who was superb at the line on the page. But I do think that there were people like Nolan Igor and Brent Kennelly and others, and the wonderful Paul Dirk and others. And if you mentioned my first name, it's because poor Paul isn't well, and I just so send my regards to him, because he made poetry. He helped create a great public for poetry in Ireland. And there are so many, there's such good work now happening. Yeah.
There really is. Thank you, President. Well, we have a couple of roving mics, so I might ask if there are hands raised and they will find you. We have one here at the front.
Sorry.
Please tell us who you are before you ask your...
My name is Ava. I'm from Ireland and I'm doing a Master's of Creative Writing. And I was just wondering, regarding food security, what is the principal division between people on the ground and those charged with making policy proposals?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I understand the question. Effectively, it goes like this, is that you could say, if I answer the question from an African perspective, it's probably the easiest way. You have some people saying is that the issue in relation to global food production is in fact to take the continent of Africa, 10%, which has the largest amount of underutilized arable land and has huge resources and so forth, and use it to produce in the most efficient way the largest amount of food. That's one view that is very much the agronomy. Effectively then, in relation how to make that happen, you do that in fact by using highly by developed seeds who can give you the highest yield and so forth. 10 years ago, 7 companies controlled the seeds of the intercontinent of Africa. Today it is 2. So you have huge monopolistic tendencies in relation to seeds, in relation to fertilizers, in relation to the transportation of food, in relation to the production of the necessary refrigeration, for example, so that even if it wouldn't waste, it's not wasted. So that's one side of the argument. And there are even very, very good people who have written books such as, for example, How to Feed the World and at the same time create in a sustainable way meet climate change. But on the ground, in this, the most populated continent of the planet, with most of you have women working in the fields. In fact, globally, about 71% of the people who are associated with working on the land own 1% of the land. So therefore, directly to your question, there's the issue of land rights. And in some of the proposals, when I was in Dakar, and I'm very much part and join with other people who are trying to deal with all the issues in a proper way. But the contracts that have been established across 40 different countries are ones that are a bit loaded towards the international global corporations model, rather than towards what I regard as the necessary transformative people on the ground. Women, for example, who need land rights. You need, in fact, actually countries that can establish seed banks. You can, as well as that, you need to be able to acknowledge original and there's a kind of a tendency to look at the same package for everybody, but then you have to take account of the different, not only in relation to soils, but in relation to practices in relation to the land itself, and through herding and through all of this. So that's the other side of it, and there is an alliance of 40 organisations for sustainable agricultural response. And those 40 organisations are network organisations. The Irish organisation, Trócaire, is affiliated, I think, to one of them. So this is the choice. It is, in fact, actually between doing it from the ground up, and which means, in fact, running in contradiction to some of the assumptions of the existing model. So that's what it is about. And it will be the biggest issue. I think that it is interesting that in some of the proposals, for example, if you take that great lung of the world, that is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, one version of the model that I look at would in fact lead to a deforestation in that lung of an area the size of Ghana. So this is once again why these meetings and people talking about all of these issues and global issues is that no one, I believe that there's a huge support for doing it the right way. And I believe that, for example, if you take in the Irish government's approach towards, for example, it has moved on from hunger to malnutrition to stunting towards all of these. It is possible to do the policies the right way, but what is missing, I think, at the present time is the ground emphasis. And I don't underestimate the difficulties, for I'll put it like this. If you're dealing with a clique or you're dealing with a dictatorship, it's very, very easy for a multinational to deal directly with a very small number of people. And if on the other hand, is the point, if you do it the way I'm saying about breaking dependency and you move from the village out, you're not only that, you're enhancing the cooperation between older people and young people, you're encouraging people to participate as citizens, and you're improving the democratic fibre of the country. So what it has is the emphasis has to shift to the ground, and it can do so. But the argument about it is that the development aid models are inclined to come down from above. And very often it is a problem about some of the foundations who are doing very good work, but they're not offering transparency in relation to what is happening. And I think this is one way why in many cases you train people, in fact, how to know what's working. I remember seeing a very, very powerful example, a very limited example in Uganda, where in fact the money going to build a new school, no one knew where it had gone to or anything. But the biggest single influence over a period of 5 years was the local radio station. For months the people knew that in fact something had been allocated, but it hadn't arrived where it was and so on. So this is why if I like the idea of breaking dependency is the issue. And therefore breaking dependency then means meeting the sufficiency needs. And you can combine that with universal rights, basic rights, and you're on your way to a very democratic participating society. Doing it the other way might appear a shortcut and so forth, but it means actually missing out the opportunity of what I have just described in breaking dependency.
Good. Thank you, President. Now, we have an online audience here tonight as well, and we have somebody in the House who's been monitoring the online questions. So,
thank you. Yeah, so this is a question from our online audience. So, in some respects, literature has caught the migratory experience better than some formal social studies. Might you have any examples of that?
So everybody could hear that question, which again, from the writerly perspective, I certainly appreciate, which is about whether the literature of migration catches the migratory experience in a different way.
Now, I don't want to sound pedantic, but I wrote an article on that in 1985. I want to answer the question. It was published in the journal, the Crane Bag.
Wonderful journal, the Crane Bag.
Yeah, but what I mean by this is very interesting. I've said that the sociological models, which fed into policy models, tended to see migrants as being acted upon. It was one of the interesting things in Clyde Mitchell's article on the causes of labour migration all those years ago, is that he drew on Durkheim, and he drew a distinction between the factors that influenced the rate of migration and that which was the incidence of migration. You might be at risk by being a member of a particular category, but then it would be an event in the family or in the locality that made you took the decision to actually migrate. Clyde Mitchell used that Durkheimian distinction, but it still had the idea in many ways of the migrant being kind of acted upon. Whereas the essence of the whole thing is that it's the transience, the migrant is continually reconstituting new worlds to manage new situations. I think While I think of it, I should say Patrice Lumumba was one of the people who worked with Valdo Pons for his book Stanleyville. But one of the things that happens then in managing that trend, if you take, I took very much, I think when I was that, if you take the two islanders, it's easiest, is Liam O'Flaherty, for example, and Padre O'Donnell. You could take Patrick Micheal, you could Donald MacAulick and all of these. And what they're describing is this very transience, that a kind of an over-determined model in the social sciences doesn't allow for that agency. And thus, it's so valuable not only in relation to migration, but there's a lovely story about the acquisitive instinct. If you take Liam O'Flaherty's short story, Two Lovely Beasts, which is about the cow has twin calves, and normally you would sell one of the calves, but he decides that they're going to be big people, so he has both calves sucking under the cow, and his wife and the children are crying that they've nothing, no milk or no anything. And he says back to them, he says, we're going to be big people. We'll open a shop. He said, and they'll smell our rashers, he said, down on the road, he said. And it goes on like this, so you get that. And again, O'Flaherty would have been in relation to the notion of acquisitiveness in his study of the MacDonald family, the House of Gold, or the neighbour's wife, or any of these. And over on the other side of it, the interesting thing they did is that O'Donnell then, on the other hand, is saying his very last book, I think, Proud Island, I remember reviewing it, he's more political. O'Donnell is an agitator, but O'Donnell is describing feelings. So therefore the human experience is caught very, very, very much in the literature. I do regret that the Patrick Micheal School has moved away from Micheal, because Micheal's work, Children at the Dead End and all of these things, that's where some of us who were studying migration and publishing on migration used to go to the Micheal School up in Glenties, and we read papers there on different kinds of migration. And part of it, one of the things about it is, if you were to say to me, there's no such thing as a simple Irish migration, but there's different waves, as I said, the saddest, I think, are the elderly men and so on that who didn't marry. They might have been hired on the lump or whatever, so that they're living very precariously. And then the men, particularly the people for sexual reasons, where there was no toleration of same-sex relations, and these people were effectively driven out of the country, and they are in London, in lonely places now at the present time, and so on. Again, if you were to look in many, many ways, I've always drawn what I think, what raises an interesting, for if there are any sociology students in relation to it, it's the whole notion of structural functionalism, which I've rejected, and I would argue for a phenomenological approach, and that values qualitative research as structuring the aim of the research, and then actually following the disciplines of quantitative research in relation for empirical verification.
Thank you. Well, we might have one more question, if I can. And actually, I'm just going to take one question at the front. I'm sorry for those at the back. We're just going to take the President's time in the green, please.
Augdron, Diagwich, Guskurv Margaret. I'm wondering, in the kind of overlapping categories you were in when you were a postgrad here at Manchester, of student and as migrant, were there any kind of significant experiences that sort of still hold significance for you in your life today? And you spoke about the hostility, particularly in the political sphere, that universities and migrants are experiencing at the moment. I was wondering what you think institutes of higher education can do to sort of mitigate or counter that hostility.
Yeah. So the question was about the crossing over of your experience as a student at Manchester and then as a citizen in the city. And then the second part of the question is about the migrants and universities. So I'll come back to that second part. But
Yes,
first.
I do. I think I'll give an example of when I was hired by the National University in 1969, free education had come in 1966, secondary education. So a number of Garrod O'Tuig, who the historian and I were both appointed the same day, but I remember we set up the first tutorials because we realised this. You had a number of students who felt the university with a sense of strangeness and how to manage it and things like that. And we very quickly found out that if a person made a fist of lasting as far as Christmas, they had a good chance of finishing the year. And in many cases as well, I remember myself in arriving in Dover Street, and this strange building that I think is still there, but Sammy Finer was the professor of government, and he would come down for a coffee break, and Max Lussman and Emrys Peters were in anthropology, Peter Worsley was in sociology, and others. But if you were to ask, where is the library? There wasn't anyone to tell you, in a way. The university was very split and scattered in different places. And then there was something that is part of it as well. Some of the African scholars, I remember in Dallas, would have arrived with a huge bundle of data, and you'd be asking them, how are you doing? Things like that. I said, I'm just looking for a theoretical framework. So and then after a while, suffering, looking for the elusive theoretical framework, and that, we'd see people stress arising. And I think it is, I haven't the answer to it, or I wouldn't attempt it, but I do think about scholarship. But where we are in relation to the migrant thing, in many cases, which are very strongly, is certainly in Ireland, anyone, I'd encourage them to bring their own story with them. This is why the publication of the Irish in Britain, Liam Hart's book was so important. And when I looked at it first, and I was preparing the lecture for 2012, I'd give it a difference, an interesting, when I mentioned Liam O'Flaherty earlier. Liam O'Flaherty changed his mind a few times. He has a patron, Edward Garnett, in London. And he writes to Edward Garnett, and he said, I keep going around here, but nothing important around here. It is in London that things matter, and it's about, because he's sucking up to his patron and so forth. And then in the same year, about 6 months later, and he writes about it, he said, I'm tired of writing to meet other people's expectations. I'll write now about what strikes me in my own soul, or whatever like that. And that's in O'Flaherty. In many, many cases, he can't make up his mind. But I think one of the things that was about the book on Liam's book was in relation to migrants' accounts. They didn't write it for publication in literary journals. They wrote it was in a sense of authenticity of the person and things like that. Is what we did, what we experienced, what we felt matters, and it should be written down somewhere, and things like that. And they write, and these accounts are infallible testaments, and they're great sources of how it was experienced. And thus, this is why I have such grave reservations about it. I'm President of Ireland. I have to be careful about many countries' assumptions in relation to their migration policy. I think in many cases there's something very, very crude about a phrase like managing a tide, or what is needed is an actual understanding, coming to understand what is involved. And they are very interesting. People have very contradictory attitudes. When I visited, for example, I spoke on migration in the United States more than once. And if you take the pre-famine migrants who were settled and property owners, when they saw the waves coming after them of the post-famine, and in many cases, every now and again you'll see it surfacing in the accounts, We had to go through this to establish ourselves. Why should it be easy for them? And so forth. And what's missing there is in many cases where the whole purpose of all of these subjects should be rather, this is what attracted me really. Why take a paperback of so old as Talade Chardin's? I think that what Chardin was attempting was in fact actually to touch what it means to be human. And this is why it is so important about why people, should be anxious about the assumptions that are being uncontested, about how people can drift into war, people can drift into an acceptance of poverty, people are as victims listening to an uncontrollable social media where you have conglomerates who own it, who don't exercise their responsibilities. I want to say that I want to thank you for your patience for making this this exercise of my bearing my soul possible.
At this point, an astonishing almost 2 hours, President Higgins, an enemy of that immobility the Chardin writes about, I think it's fair to say, and our Registrar, Patrick Hackett, will now offer a vote of thanks on behalf of the University and the House tonight.
Thank you, John. Well, what a way this has been to start the lecture series, and what an honour it has been to have had the privilege of hearing such an erudite and stimulating address from the President. Well, and for a fair number of us here tonight, may I say, our President, on his thoughts about the role and importance of universities, especially as environments for thinking freely and the challenges facing them. How fitting too, President Higgins, that you drew upon your experience of and links to Manchester, and for us, brought your insights even closer to home. I need hardly add that in getting these lectures underway with such substance and passion, you have set the bar very high. Please accept our sincere and grateful thanks for everything you have done this evening. What has also contributed to the success of this occasion is the Q&A session, and I'd like to thank John McAuliffe very much for chairing that session as our moderator, and to everyone, both here in the theatre and online, who asked questions or contributed in other ways. And of course, events such as this don't happen by magic. My final expression of thanks goes to the very many individuals, colleagues within our university and friends outside of it, including those at Ireland's consulate here in Manchester, who have worked incredibly well as a team to ensure that all the arrangements were in place and went so smoothly. A huge thank you to each and every one of you. So we will now move down to the ground floor of the building, where there is a drinks reception with canapes, also generously supported by John Kennedy, so you're all kindly invited there. But I'd ask you all, please, to just remain in your seats until the President and his delegation have left the lecture theatre. So finally, will you join me now in one last very big Manchester round of applause for President Dr. Michael D. Higgins.